So I'm going to show you a summary of what these 8 reviews said, because I was trying to find out if there's any controversy here, or whether or not I was being led in the dark. Maybe I was, I was confused. I wanted to find out whether there was any controversy in the scientific literature. So I'm going to summarize the 8 reviews for you. Reviewer number 1, scientific data indicate that animals fed by GM crops have been harmed or died. Okay, again, that's reviewer number 1, the Journal of Medical Biotechnology. Okay. Reviewer number 2, most products have been found nutritionally safe, although a majority of the studies were associated with industry producers. Why did he even have to say that? There must have been something in his mind saying, oh, when you have industry producers producing the science, maybe we should take another look at it. So that was the way of saying it. Reviewer number 3, many GM foods have had some common toxic effects. Reviewer number 4, and this is just a summary because they do a lot of stuff in between, but this is what they end up with, which is all that's necessary to tell you whether they are, totally saying everything is safe or not. Reviewer number 4, the studies reviewed present evidence to show that GM plants are nutritionally equivalent to their non-GM counterparts, can be safely used in food and feed. Okay, there's one who has nothing to complain about. Reviewer number 5, majority of animal feeding experiments did not indicate clinical effects or abnormalities in organ tissues exposed to exposed animals, but there were some adverse effects were noted, but they were difficult to interpret due to shortcomings in the studies. I found that to be very interesting because they didn't cite any shortcomings in the studies that found no harm. They only seemed to find the shortcomings in the studies that found harm. And those studies were published in peer-reviewed journals as well. So, reviewer number 6, health effects of GMOs are unknown. Many people prefer to stay away from these foods. Not much is known about the long-term effects on humans. Not much is known. They didn't do experiments on long-term effects. There's a difference between exposing an animal to 90 days, and if the animal gets tumors or some kind of terrible disease, that's short-term toxic effect. But if you study the animal for its life for 3 years, that's a whole different kind of study. Then you're looking at chronic effects. So reviewer number 6 says, there's a lot we don't know. So how can we say automatically that everything is safe when we haven't even done the experiments? And there's only 8 reviews, so I'm not going to. Reviewer number 7, most common result has been no effects at the macroscopic level. That means they haven't seen an organ failure. Macro meaning the big level. They haven't seen big tumors. But at the subcellular level, there are some problems. And not only that, but reviewer number 7 says something really important. There's no standardized methods for evaluating GM foods. How in the world are you going to reach a conclusion about whether it's safe or not if you don't have a standardized method for evaluating it? The necessity of testing GM crops case by case has been established. This person says, we've got it, in this case it could be a group of people because these articles may have been written by groups. This person says we have to test each new substance on an individual basis, which is what we don't do in the United States. Finally, the last reviewer, there were no adverse effects of GM crops for many species of animals in acute or short-term feeding studies, but serious debate still surrounds long-term and multi-generational feeding studies, which are necessary to further investigate this issue. Okay, those were the 8 reviews. From that, I concluded there's no consensus. There really is anything but a consensus. I also found 26 articles that cited adverse effects when animal studies with GMOs. There are many more articles with no adverse effects. But what do we do with these 26 studies? What do we do with them? There's one scientist said approximately 5% of the safety studies on them, GMOs, show adverse effects that are cause for concern and tend to be featured in media reports. Well, sure they tend to be featured in media reports. People want to know if there's any adverse effects. 5%, is that small? When it comes to assessing risks of products, foods or drugs, we learn more from the studies that show hazards than the ones that do not. Just think of this. Imagine 100 test flights with a new commercial jet. 95 go without a hitch. 5 have severe problems, structural failure, electrical breakdown, landing gear malfunction. Do we just discard the 5 and claim we have a safe plane? Ah, no. Those 5 are very, very important. Until they find out what is going on with those 5 cases, they will not have a safe plane. But people who say, oh no, we just got 5% of the studies that are problematic, let's just throw them away. I'm going to tell you about 2 of the most prominent animal studies in GMOs. One of them was published in 1999, and the other was published in 2012. And this goes to the 3rd pillar of skepticism, because I'm going to tell you the way these people were treated, we have not seen yet in science. These people were, because they found adverse effects, they were basically marginalized, and their careers were, at least in one case, the career was completely destroyed. And as a person who is invested in ethics and science, I found this to be really a very terrible situation. So I'm going to start with the Pusztai affair. Arpad Pusztai, internationally recognized expert on lectins. Now, most people don't know what lectins are, but they are plants that have natural insecticidal properties. So that's why in organic agriculture, sometimes they'll put a plant with certain lectins that the insects don't like next to another crop, so the insects won't want to come close to the crop that they want to protect. He published 300 scientific articles, 5 books, including one on lectin handbook. Here were some of his books in English and in German. Pusztai was a senior investigator at the Rowan Institute in Aberdeen, Scotland, a very respected institute. He was responsible for 8 research programs. He had funding from very different sources. In 1995, he responded to a request for a proposal from the Scottish Office of Agriculture and other agencies, and his was chosen to do a study of genetically modified potato. And at the time, Rowan had a profit-sharing agreement with a genetics company, which they made known, which financed the development of a transgenic potato. And if the potato were commercialized, Rowan would share the profits. Okay? So they had an interest in this genetic potato. And Pusztai thought the potato would be a good choice to test the genetic modification. So he chose some genes from a plant called the snowdrop, which was a flowering plant. And it had a protein in that plant that repels or kills insects. That was his specialty, lectins. And he took that protein and he fed it directly to rats. It had no effect on the rats when they were fed that particular protein, that particular lectin. He extracted it in pure form, fed it to the rats, they were fine. So he figured, okay, this protein doesn't harm the rats. So he took the particular genes for that protein and he put them, and then he put them into the potato. He also published a paper on GM peas fed to rats, no response. So he thought, okay, I'm on a good course. I can do this with potatoes, and let's test it and see. He was open. He didn't want to claim that his GM potato was going to be safe without testing it. So this is a little too detailed. So the results of his study on the potato was the rats on the GM diet had poor growth, and of course he had the rats, he fed them with regular potato, and then he fed them with GM potato. So you always have to have a control. And he said the ones fed on the GM diet had poor growth, immune problems, and even though the lectin, that protein, caused no adverse effects at high concentrations, it affected his rats. Well, he published his paper in the journal The Lancet, which is one of the most preeminent journals in the world. And it described how the GM potato had affected his rats. And he had a co-author. They published the paper, as they say, in October 1999. The Lancet began publishing in 1823. And it's very well known. Its impact factor, 39, it's one of the highest rated journals in the world. And he had 6 reviewers and 5 recommended publication, and 1 thought it shouldn't be, so they published it. And they sent it to 6 reviewers. Usually they send it to 2 or 3, but they knew it was going to be controversial. He went on TV and expressed his views about the GM potatoes. And for one day, he became a hero at his institute because they liked to have their scientists noted by the press for 2 days. And the press besieged him. But then the phone calls came from the Prime Minister's office. And within a few days, Pusztai was fired. He didn't have tenure at this institute the way we have at universities. He was silenced with threats of a lawsuit. His team was dismantled. All of his research was stopped. The institute, the biotech industry, and the UK government together launched a smear campaign to destroy his career. Now, this controversy was going on for months, and if you read the papers in the United Kingdom, every day they had stories about it. Rarely was there a story in the United States papers. And the director of Rowe at the Institute, they began to discredit him, using ageist language. You know, he was an older person, and maybe he's gone off the deep end. The single Lancet reviewer who opposed the publication, and I spoke to him personally, he broke a 200-year-old rule of not discussing referees' comments. He went public with his refereed comments. The other 5 reviewers didn't say a word. You know, when you're a reviewer, and I am a reviewer of many articles, I would never tell the press what my review was. My review only goes to the editor-in-chief, not to the press. So this person, he went to the press, John Pickett. And later on, we learned that Rowe Institute received $224,000 from Monsanto. And there was a lot more going on. And Downing Street got a call from President Bill Clinton, whose administration was spending billions backing the GM industry. And according to the British press, Clinton had told the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, that it wouldn't be good for our biotech industry if this article in the Lancet was protected and supported. So, his co-author was quoted as saying, "I couldn't understand how on Monday, our pod, Pusztai, had made the most wonderful breakthrough, and on Tuesday it was the most dreadful piece of work and immediately rejected out of hand." Yes, all of a sudden, he was completely fired. So, his co-author also had quite a distinguished record. And Pusztai said, "Supposedly in my previous 279 papers, some 40 of them with the same design and methodology, I was scientifically all right. But then suddenly I had a mental breakdown." And that's essentially what happened. So I began looking at this thinking there's more than science going on here. This is political science. Now, so that's the first story, and that makes me skeptical when I hear the way a scientist was treated, a respected scientist was treated in this way. The second came 13 years later. Gilles Eric Seralini, a professor at the University of Caen in France, in Normandy. He published a study on genetically modified maize, corn. And he published the study in a leading U.S. journal, a journal that people from industry publish in, people from universities, Food and Chemical Toxicology, very respected American journal. And it was peer-reviewed by the reviewers, and it was passed, and it was published. And according to the study that he did with GM maize, females developed large mammary tumors, almost always more often than the controls, and he described other things that was wrong with the organs of the animals that he had tested. And he was testing the GMO corn. He was also testing with Roundup as well, Roundup, the herbicide. He found necrosis, liver damage, etc., much higher than in the controls. And he had many, many problems with the animals just from the GMO, not from the control. So at first, when he published the story, there was an upsurge of criticism. As you can imagine, Monsanto had leashed a campaign to discredit the scientist and the article. And at first, the editors of the journals supported Seralini, and they said, you know, we trust our reviewers. But then, as the pressure built up, the journal editors did something that outraged members of the scientific community. It took about a year when the pressure on the journal started to build. And after a year, they retracted the paper without the permission of the author. Now, there are many papers retracted. Usually, they find a problem in the paper, and the author says, yes, I made a mistake, and the author agrees to retract the paper. Or there's some kind of ethical misconduct, and then the paper is retracted. Sometimes it's very humiliating to have your paper retracted. In this case, the authors of the paper did not want their paper retracted. And the editor-in-chief of the journal, in retracting the paper, said the following: unequivocally, the editor-in-chief, talking about himself, found no evidence of fraud or intentional misrepresentation of the data. Ultimately, the results presented, while not incorrect, are inconclusive and therefore do not reach the threshold of publication for food and chemical toxicology. Now, if you talk to most scientists, they'll tell you almost every scientific study is inconclusive. You always have to repeat studies. There's always something that can be done better. You always have to go and try it again. You never get retracted because your study is inconclusive. So this is the journal. That was the name of the study, long-term toxicity. It was the first long-term study done on genetically modified food. You see the number of people who participated in this study. It wasn't just one person. It was a group of well-respected scientists. And there is the red mark on the paper, retracted. And that means that if you're an active scientist, you can't cite the paper anymore. It goes out of the scientific community. You're not allowed to cite it. If you cite a retracted paper, a journal will not publish your paper. That's the kind of protocol there is in science. 100 scientists pledged an open letter to boycott the publisher for retracting the paper without grounds. In another unprecedented event, absolutely unprecedented, right after that journal retracted the paper, another journal said, we'll publish the paper. Now, usually, one journal will never publish a paper that another journal retracts. But they knew that this retraction was not kosher. It was not legal. It was really unethical to retract the paper for the grounds that they did. So another paper published, another journal published the paper, European Sciences Journal. Again, I don't recall in anything in the history of science that ever showed that has ever happened. Okay, so those are the two cases. What do we do with 26 studies that show adverse effects? Why haven't they been replicated? I have to reach the conclusion that politics and conflict of interest have so infused the science that the public can have no assurance of the safety of GMOs. It's just too infested with the politics of what's going on, the politics of the industry. The Environmental Sciences Europe published a study signed by over 300 independent researchers, said there's no scientific consensus on GMO safety. 300 scientists published in the Environmental Sciences Europe, 2015. We're beginning to see articles come out that tell us the differences between GMOs and non-GMOs. The American Journal of Plant Sciences wrote that GMOs had lower levels of potassium and higher levels of iron than the conventional non-GMO crop. Why, by putting a gene into it, do you get higher and lower levels of other components in the crop? That's because it's like an ecosystem. That's because by putting the gene in, it can have an interaction with other genes. And those other genes might determine a higher or lower level of ingredients. Now, you may not want lower levels of potassium or higher levels of iron. You need to know about this. It's got to be tested and labeled. Now, the National Academy, in its 500-page paper, said, well, you can't really do these animal tests. You have to really do something they call, you have to test all the proteins that come out of the GMO, compare it to the non-GMO. They recognize that you can put a gene in and it's going to change the nature of the plant. And they start giving you a way of trying to do this. They say, well, you know, you've got to test this. They call it omics analysis. Omics analysis. That's a term that merely means you have to test all the proteins, the metabolites. You have to test everything that comes out of the new plant, comparing it to the old plant. It's very nice, except nobody does it. No regulatory agency does it. And it would take years to do it right, so maybe it should take years before they put it on the market. For example, somebody did an omics analysis of GM maize, and they found that it caused metabolism disturbances caused by the transformation process. In other words, by putting it in, it changed the nature of that plant genome. So people started to do what the Academy said they should do, and they found differences. Nobody paid any attention to those studies. BT corn has a higher lignin content than non-BT corn. Okay, we're beginning to see these things. Nobody pays any attention to them because they already made their mind up that the GM crops are safe. So they're not looking at these studies that are coming out. You get other studies that said that the weight of evidence supports the soybeans are as safe as non-GM soybeans. So you do get studies that, but then you look at the conflict of interest statement on this study. This is a study that says, no problem, non-GM soybeans and soybeans are the same, and then you look at the conflict of interest statement in the journal article. I don't know if you can read it. During the conduct of this study, the authors of this article were employed by Dow AgroSciences. Give me a break. What else are they going to say? So, you know, you've got to look at the conflict of interest statements. You are totally wrong about genetically altered food. Well, are we? In which way are we wrong? That's the whole question. Thank you.